Hi all, welcome back to Environmental Science 101. In this lecture, we're going to talk about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a huge player in environmental science. When we talk about global climate change, when we talk about carbon dioxide levels, when we talk about evolution of organisms, change in organisms over time, when we talk about water quality, all these things can be linked to plants, and the way plants get energy to grow is through the process of photosynthesis. So if you're interested in learning having a deeper dive into photosynthesis, I suggest watching this YouTube video that I've linked here. Is through North Dakota State and their cellular biology department, where they look at kind of the molecular components of photosynthesis. You can check out some YouTube videos that I have on my YouTube channel where I cover all the components of photosynthesis, or many of the components of photosynthesis, deep dive into it, photosystems, what pigments are used, how resonant energy works, all those kind of things. But if you're in this course for environmental science, it's probably just beneficial enough for you to know kind of the photosynthesis equation, how that's linked up to cellular respiration, what components go in, what components come out. You don't actually need to know the molecular pieces necessarily. Okay, so let's dive into kind of photosynthesis. Before we get into photosynthesis, we kind of have to talk about those players that we've already talked about. Remember, we talked about John Baptist van Helmont, okay, his work with willow trees in pots, and deciding that it's not the soil that's contributing to the overall mass of the organism, but it's the atmosphere. Sinberg's work that kind of connected plants and oxygen, and how plants, as a waste product, produce oxygen, and that oxygen is needed by organisms like us in order to survive. And it was the evolution of plants that really gave rise to the evolution of most other organisms. And then Satch's research that linked chlorophyll, okay, and we'll talk a little bit about chlorophyll, but linked chlorophyll to sugars, and kind of the connection between chlorophyll molecules and monosaccharides, or simple sugars. And then Presley's work, which Jen Ingenhouse kind of used similar design to Presley's work. Remember, Presley was sticking like mice in a glass container with a candle and seeing how long they could live. And then stick a mouse in a glass container with a plant, see how long it can live. Ingenhouse kind of similar projects with plants, and today these projects are done all the time, but sticking plants in the sunlight versus in the shade, to see kind of how much oxygen or carbon dioxide is reduced in a container, how much oxygen is produced, these kind of things. And so his project, John's project, really was about sunlight and kind of the role that sunlight plays, or photons play, on driving photosynthesis. So he left the plants in the shade, and then left plants in the sun, and he noticed, what's happening to the oxygen level. Is the oxygen increasing? And of course it does in the sun, and it really doesn't change much in the shade, because without photons the plant cannot go through photosynthesis. That's a major component of photosynthesis. Okay, so early research in really the 1700s, 1800s kind of drove the formation of hypotheses around photosynthesis. And then as modern technology caught up to science, we were able to look at the exact proteins and pigments and the cells that are involved, and track things over time. and now we know a lot about photosynthesis, a lot more than what we did. Okay, so we credit Ingenhouse with the discovery of photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight into sugars or carbohydrates. Now, realize that Ingenhouse just put all the pieces together. I'm not taking anything away from Ingenhouse, but the work of Helmont, Simberg, Zach, Presley all contribute to this, but Ingenhouse was the individual who designed experiments both on terrestrial landscapes and in water to discover that indeed plants absorb sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and use the energy from the sun to combine carbon dioxide and water to make sugar. Okay, and so Ingenhouse's experiments describe not only this process but also this process in water. So you can use plants that are aquatic, and you can see that under light that you can visualize the production of oxygen, which is a waste product for plants. Okay, oxygen is actually toxic for plants, much like carbon dioxide is toxic for us. So to plants, carbon dioxide is useful for the generation of energy. Oxygen's a waste product. To us, oxygen's useful to the generation of energy. Carbon dioxide's a waste product. That is kind of the photosynthesis cellular respiration cycle that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But that's the brilliancy of this, and that's from an evolutionary perspective. That was one of the greatest things to evolve on the planet, was the connection between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, because it creates a giant cycle. And so when carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere, oxygen is put back in. We take oxygen, and other organisms that go through cellular respiration take oxygen out of the atmosphere and put carbon dioxide back in. Okay, so some things, we talked about this before when we talked about the visible light spectrum. Okay, green plants are typically able to use the visible light spectrum. They also use ultraviolet light. They also can potentially use some infrared portions of the spectrum. But nonetheless, this goes back to kind of why we see color. Color is the wavelength that is being reflected. So in the case of this picture, you can see you have these green spike mosses, and you have this green plant that's growing out of this kind of brown seed here. We see all that green because the wavelength of roughly 550 nanometers is being reflected back. The wavelengths outside of that 550 nanometers, so towards the lower end around 390, 400, okay, towards the higher end 700, 750. So the red is the higher end, the kind of the purples and the blues are the lower end. Those are all being absorbed, utilized for photosynthesis, and that 550 or so is being reflected back. So it kind of brings us to that question: what relationship does this process, photosynthesis, absorbing light, carbon dioxide, and water, what relationship does it have to do with this plant putting on mass? Okay, and really that came about by Nicholas Sassarus, who basically recreated. You can see a kind of a trend here. Scientists typically will use other scientists' research and regenerate it, maybe change a little bit here, change a little bit there, use a different organism to kind of get at a little bit more of an answer. Okay, so if you remember Jean-Baptiste van Helmont experiment on willows, and planting willows in soil, and then measuring the soil, measuring how much mass the willow put on, discovered that the mass was coming from the atmosphere, but Jean-Baptiste didn't know what was being pulled out of the atmosphere. He just knew that the mass of the soil was not changing over time. And so it had to be the atmosphere that is contributing to it. Nicholas Saucer discovered that it was carbon dioxide, that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is what's being pulled in and changing the mass. Right? And so he concluded that most of the growth, most of the mass gained by a plant is due to the absorbing of carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil. But the water itself is combined with the air, right, to form carbohydrates. And as long as your experiment, you're continuously adding water, the soil itself mass rarely changes because you're always adding that mass back in. Atmosphere is the same. Like if you were in a closed system and you didn't add carbon dioxide back in, then your plant would not survive. Okay, but normally, especially under a lot of experiments, it's hard to determine what the carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, especially in open air experiments. And so it took a while before we could start designing experiments where we could have a closed system, pump carbon dioxide in a known amount, add water a known amount, and then look at the mass of the organism and the gain of the mass of the organism. And that really came about and gave us this kind of photosynthesis equation. And so this is a very famous photosynthesis equation, and that we now know how many molecules are needed to form organic matter. Okay? So we need 6 carbon dioxide molecules from the atmosphere, 6 molecules of water, sunlight, okay, or photons. And this doesn't have to be free energy. Currently, we utilize lots of fossil fuels to drive this equation. Okay, but if you use photons from the sun, it's free. Okay, you're not digging up these old sources of energy to drive work. So if you're using photons, or you could use wind, okay, in both those cases, that's what's typically called renewable energy. So meaning that it's free, it doesn't cost anything, it's reoccurring on the planet. You'll never deplenish it. Okay, but at any rate, you need about 40 photons is what's on average. About 40 photons to drive enough energy to form one glucose molecule. Okay, so you can see 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, 40 photons, whether this is coming from the sun or another energy source, forms 1 molecule of glucose, which is C6H12O6, and 6 molecules of oxygen. Again, I understand from a human perspective, we think this is a product of the plant. Okay, like the plant is generating oxygen because we use it, and we use the glucose. But the plant is not generating oxygen from like a benefit of the plant. The plant can use glucose, and it does. That's their energy source also. But oxygen is a waste product. And if that oxygen is allowed to build up in the tissue of the plant, it'll kill the plant. So we got to think of oxygen actually as a waste product for plants. It's hugely beneficial for organisms that breathe in oxygen and utilize it for cellular respiration. Okay. Speaking of cellular respiration is the process by which organisms that don't make their own food, so we call organisms that make their own food, we call them autotrophs or autotrophic, okay, meaning they can make their own food. Organisms that don't make their own food are heterotrophs or heterotrophic, and typically they go through a process or some process similar to cellular respiration. There are some that don't go through cellular respiration, they go through fermentation, which doesn't need oxygen, but a lot of organisms, they require oxygen to go through cellular respiration. Okay, and that process is really breaking down complex molecules. It's not just complex molecules in the sense of sugars. It's also proteins and fats and nucleic acids that go into that cellular respiration. Okay? But even at that, when we talk about sugar, this is the reverse of the photosynthesis equation. Okay? We have glucose coming in. You have to have oxygen for the process to work, because oxygen is an electron acceptor. Okay? And if you want to know more about this, we can talk about it at a different time, or you can watch other videos of mine that talk about why it's important. And as a waste product, we get carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of it, 6 molecules of water. This look familiar? 6, 6. Okay? It's basically the other side of the photosynthesis equation. But instead of putting energy in, cellular respiration gets energy out. So the process of breaking one molecule of glucose down generates about 38 ATP. So in general, the process nets, like if you did a 1-for-1 calculation, if you took and you said, all right, well, how much energy is needed to go into a plant to produce 1 molecule of glucose, and then how much energy comes out to produce ATP for said organism, it's about 30 ATP goes into a plant to produce 1 molecule of glucose, and you get 38 or so in return from that molecule of glucose. So it is a net gain, but it's a net gain that is hugely advantageous when the source of energy to make glucose is free. It's photons from the sun. Right? Then it's a total net gain, and that drove evolution on this planet. It's a net gain of energy for the organisms on this planet that consume plants, that consume sunlight to drive stored energy processes. Okay? And so when we look at photosynthesis and cellular respiration, they really are a cycle, or they complement each other. They form this basis of flow of energy that occurs on the planet. You disrupt it by decreasing the amount of water on the planet. You disrupt it by increasing the amount of carbon dioxide, changing oxygen levels. You can disrupt that energy flow. You disrupt it by removing the organisms that do photosynthesis, then you have less energy flow. Right? And we'll talk more about kind of that process as we go. So let's talk about energy flow real quick, a little bit more on that energy flow. Okay, so energy flow works kind of through the laws of thermodynamics. Okay, so both laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics most people are very familiar with, and that is energy is not created or destroyed, it just changes form. All the energy that's on the planet is here to stay, it just changes form. So you eat an ice cream, that ice cream generates energy. That energy can be used to drive motion. Okay? If you don't have any motion, that energy still is changing form. So sometimes it's just leaving as heat, sometimes it's being stored as fat, other times it's being stored, especially in an organism like a human, it's being stored to keep and maintain your body temperature at 98.6 degrees. Okay, but that energy is just transforming, right, from one state to another. Sunlight, photons, okay, transforming into chemical energy. That chemical energy transforming into motion energy. Okay, whoops, sorry about that. And so in all cases, you still get that kind of chemical, whether it's fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are just old chemical energy. Is energy that was once in the chemical form that's been buried and compressed for hundreds of millions of years, and we dig it up and utilize it to drive motion. Okay? Same thing, energy that's coming out of your outlet to drive work, to produce some kind of energy, whether that be heat your house, cook your food, whatever. And that energy is coming from somewhere. Sometimes it's this chemical energy, sometimes it's energy of motion. Okay? So like wind turbines, water, sometimes it's radiant energy. Okay? Sometimes it's nuclear energy, so you're breaking and disrupting atoms, which is going to release energy, which is used to heat water, which creates steam, which turns motion and generates electricity. And we'll come back and talk more about these later on in the quarter. But during each transformation, the kind of one of the big things is during each transformation, some energy is lost. Okay? The ability, the best system, is to lose as little energy as possible. Okay? If the system that is in place loses lots of energy, then the transformation is there's potentially more loss, or this transformation has to happen more often. Okay? And so we'll talk about transformation of energy from a solar perspective, from a kind of a flowing perspective, whether that be hydroelectric dams or wind turbines. We'll talk about the transformation of energy from a chemical perspective, being fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, coal, okay? And we'll look at what is the transfer rate, okay? And that transfer rate can be really important, okay? If you're losing lots of energy to the atmosphere or lots of energy in heat, then you have to continue that transformation more, okay? And so that second law of thermodynamics is really what we call entropy. And entropy is getting at energy loss or energy disturbance. Okay? And one way to look at this is things that are organized have to have energy continuously supplied in order to keep those things as they are. Okay? So if you're thinking about, if you think about just in a simple object, let's say, let's talk about maybe a bicycle, and you have that bike, and you leave that bike sitting in the environment, and no new energy is being put into the bike, and it's sitting outside, and it just sits there. Over time, that object's going to break down, okay? Because disorder happens. It takes energy to maintain that object over a period of time. Okay? Same thing with living objects. Of course, humans, you take energy to maintain. Plants take energy to maintain. But even objects that are man-made take energy to maintain over a period of time. If you put energy into that bike, okay, if you put things back into that bike, so over time that bike, instead of allowing it to rust and be exposed to the elements, hey, if you prevent the breakdown, prevent water flow over it, prevent rust forming and things like that, it slows the process down. It slows entropy down. Now, entropy is still going to happen especially on objects that are not living, right? Because supplying new energy to it is difficult. But for us, right, we supply new energy to ourselves all the time to rebuild cells. Okay, your cells, your skin cells are scuffing off; they're dying constantly. You're consuming energy, rebuilding it. Okay, now eventually, again, everything will break down. Everything will have kind of a lifespan. Okay, but that transformation is really important. Okay? So between the two laws of thermodynamics, one being energy is not created nor destroyed, and the other one be kind of the law of entropy, that energy leaves the system. Okay? And that over time energy is reduced in an object. Between the two, that's really drives energy flow and drives that cycle of photosynthesis and cellular respiration on the planet. Next time when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about like food chains and food webs and how the energy moves from one group of organisms to another and the importance of that energy transfer.